All right. All right. Well, again, this is my first talk. And again, I wanted to say what an unmitigated pleasure it is to be here and see you all. And it's wonderful to be invited, and it's wonderful to be at events like this. It really reaffirms my faith in humanity, especially younger humanity. You know, you younger generation are some of the most thoughtful and intelligent and kind and compassionate people that it's ever been my privilege to know. And I really think that's one of the rewards I find so much in teaching, and because it gives me a chance to interface and get to know the next generation, the folks that are going to get us out of this mess that we've gotten ourselves into. If anybody can, you're the people. So, you know, good luck with that. Because we old people, I mean, we're going to be drooling in our gruel pretty soon, and we won't have to worry about it. But, you know, as long as there's somebody to change our diapers, you know, so hopefully this interchange that we're going to have helps with that. So the topic of this talk is neuroscience and spirituality, if you haven't already been paying attention. So let's get into it. The human brain has sometimes been called the 3-pound universe. And a famous quote is, "The universe exists for us only insofar as it exists in our brain. The brain is the 3-pound universe. Each of us lives within this universe, the prison of his or her, of course, own brain." And I've always liked this diagram from an early anatomical text from 1543. For one thing, it's always good to shock my students to look at this. This is made from an actual anatomical model from a cadaver. I've always enjoyed the expression of the gentleman who donated his brain to science for study early on. So I guess the point of this partly is that the brain is probably one of the most complex and highly organized objects in the known universe. And if you've studied systems biology, you have a notion that complexity and high degree of organization is one of the chief characteristics that characterizes biology. This is one of the things that separates the living from the non-living. As matter self-organizes itself into complex structures, you get emergent properties such as living systems. And as living systems become ever more complex, you get structures like the human brain that display further emergent properties, in this case, the emergence of consciousness. Well, is the brain the seat of the soul? We don't really know. We're comfortable with the notion that pretty much everything that goes on in consciousness and our own subjective experience of it, our thoughts, our perceptions, dreams, memories, imaginings, aspirations, and trepidations, all that makes us human are somehow intimately linked to that few 100 grams of spongy, gelatinous tissue that resides inside our skulls. If you look at, it wasn't always so, if you look historically at evolutions of the sort of the intellectual evolution of the notions of the brain and what it does, it's rather surprising because early on it was not necessarily a foregone conclusion that the soul or the mind or consciousness was really connected to the brain at all. Aristotle was really the first to make that connection. which seems to me late in human history that this notion that the brain has something to do with consciousness should emerge. But he thought that the brain was a place where all the spirits came together in common, and that's really where our term common sense comes from. So we have more or less gone with that intuition. We think that the brain is not separable, that it really is somehow inseparably linked with who we are and who we think we are. But in history, one of the conundrums that we face when we're trying to think about these things, to think about our brains, to think about consciousness, is that we're, in a sense, we're the brain trying to think about the brain. We're trying to step out of the box and understand it. And this is very difficult. The conundrum that we face is very similar to a fish trying to understand water. How do you step outside the box of your own consciousness to get the perspective on what consciousness is? This is a bit of a dilemma. And that's perhaps why consciousness is the last frontier in a sense of understanding our relationship to the universe, because we're in the box and we're trying to understand the box. Well, Descartes, of course, came along, and he's the one of, I think, therefore I am fame, and the person, the philosopher who originated the Cartesian dualism, the idea of the separation of the mind and nature, and the difference between what goes on inside and what goes on outside, and all of these profound metaphysical questions around existence and being, which have really in some ways not been helpful in the evolution of Western philosophy, because it's introduced a lot of assumptions into that relationship that don't really hold. The notion that we are somehow separated from nature, that we're somehow not part of nature. And this has plagued Western philosophical understanding ever since. Descartes had an interesting notion that the pineal gland, which is the gland, essentially the third eye chakra, as you probably all know, was somehow the site of consciousness, that it was the organ that regulated consciousness. And it did through via a series of strings. The gland was the interpreter of vision, not the receptor of vision, but the interpreter of vision, or the process, the processor of vision. And then one could respond to visual input through a series of literally strings or pulleys. So his notion was that the body was kind of a puppet. And, the brain, the pineal gland specifically, was inside there pulling the strings. And it's sort of the notion, again, like, is it me, or is it the little homunculus inside of me that's kind of running the machine of the self? And, these dualistic notions have persisted, and, they're so ingrained in our way of thinking about these things. But eventually the picture became a lot more complex as things evolved. Da Vinci, shown up at the top left, had a notion that he really could be responsible for the first serious notion of an airhead, because his idea was that the brain, the cranial space was basically a place for humors or vapors to move in and out of the body, and that the conscious activity was reflected in the movement of these humors. So he postulated that there wasn't much going on up there at all. It was just a medium for the movement of these sort of miasmic vapors, and that was the activity that generated consciousness. But then, as neuroanatomists even early on started to look at the brain structures, they could see readily that it was a lot more complicated than that, and that the brain was indeed a very complex, complex structure. And so, naturally enough, as they dissected these cadavers, they tried to relate the function of the brain to the structure of the brain, because that's what anatomists do. In a sense, they define the structure, but without the other side of that, the process side, which is sort of the province of the physiologists. You can see these complex structures. The question is, what do they do? So eventually, it emerged some of the specific brain structures that they could isolate. There were attempts to correlate them with specific areas of the brain. In other words, to define structure and function, and define the link between them. One of the kind of oddball offshoots of this in the 19th century was phrenology, which was really a pseudoscience. It was the notion that by mapping and feeling the bumps on your head, on your skull, you could relate these bumps to what was going on inside. And the phrenologists would develop these complex maps of the skull, and that was supposed to reflect some inner structure function correlation, and they could feel your head and define the bumps, and then they could say, what you were strong in, what talents you had, and this kind of thing. And they could tell much about your personality. But, it was total bunkum. I mean, there's absolutely no basis for this, at least scientifically, as far as we know. But so, that was a theory that didn't have much longevity. Well, as our tools improved, our picture of the brain and its structure-function relationships improved also. And as new techniques came along, which we now have different brain imaging techniques and this sort of thing, we had better tools to try and understand this structure-function relationship. What is the ultimate question is, what is the relation of the physical substrate of consciousness, which we now postulate is primarily located in the brain, although not entirely, and the process that we understand as consciousness, that we experience as subjective experience, our experience of being in the world. Well, now, building on the work of all these anatomists and physiologists over the last couple hundred years, and neurochemists, we shouldn't neglect that, we have a pretty good map, we think, of what parts of the brain govern what kinds of activity, what kinds of functions. So we can pretty well say, in the auditory cortex processes auditory input, the visual, the occipital lobe part of the brain processes vision, olfaction. So in other words, we can come up with a much better map of where in the brain particular functions that go together to, that are integrated together to produce subjective experience and sensory experience are localized. And of course, science is an ongoing process. So even now, these things are still being more closely defined and revised. None of this is set in stone. But I think there has been progress. And the picture that has kind of emerged from the anatomical point of view is there really isn't just one brain. There's at least three. And those of you that have taken anatomy or read about this already know this. There is, of course, the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the forebrain. The forebrain at the top being the evolutionarily more recent neocortex, this hypertrophied neocortex, which is kind of unique to human beings and is thought of as the seat of what we identify as human processes, the consciousness, the decision making, the ego, all of this Well, is not necessarily correct, but this is the picture that's emerged. The hindbrain covers more of the autonomic functions. It's the housekeeping functions of the brain that go on in the background. We don't have to pay too much attention to that, fortunately. We don't have to remind ourselves to breathe, for example, or remind our heart to beat. In most cases, because the forebrain and the autonomic nervous system is just handling all that. And in the meantime, we're busy being conscious and having conscious experience, or being busy being unconscious sometimes. But so this picture that has emerged, the brain brain is made up of various lobes. There's basically, as you saw from the previous diagram there, the brain is bilaterally symmetrical. There are two hemispheres, the right and the left, and they pretty much mirror each other in terms of their structure. So if you look at a side view of one of the lobes, then you can more or less define these different lobes, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Now, of course, in the actual neuroanatomy lab, they are not nicely colored and differentiated this way. This is an artist's rendition, but you can pretty much see that, you know, there are different lobes of the brain. So one way to look at this, so they've sort of focused on the lobe, and within the structure of the lobe, the neural architecture that mediates these different processes. So if you look at we now have a pretty good map of the functional areas of the cerebrum. I'm going to sit down. It's actually easier, I guess, for me to work it from here, if that's all right. So if we look at the auditory association area, that is pretty much located in the temporal lobe, and it processes complex auditory information. And the auditory cortex, also in the temporal lobe, basically it's the receiver, it's the microphone that detects the input, and then the association area, through complex processing, makes sense of the input. And you see this again and again. The motor association cortex, located in the frontal lobe, coordinates movement. The prefrontal cortex, also in the frontal lobe, controls higher order thinking and emotions. The primary motor cortex in the parietal lobe initiates voluntary actions. This is the part of the parietal lobe that is damaged in conditions like Parkinsonism and other types of motor impairment diseases. The primary somatosensory cortex, again part of the parietal lobe, receives tactile information, in other words touch input, and controls our response to that. The sensory association cortex is distributed between the parietal lobe and the insula, and it processes multiple bodily sensations, but not so much visual input. It promotes touch, smell, taste. In a way, what tactile information and chemically sensed information is processed in the sensory association cortex. And the speech center is, of course, the language center. It's located, one of the language centers. There are actually two, at least, that we know of. In the frontal cortex, the Broca's area, it's sometimes called after the neuroanatomist that discovered it. It governs speech production and articulation, the movement of the mouth, and an enormous amount of the neural architecture in the frontal lobe is devoted to governing the movements of the facial muscles. Some of you have probably seen the little homunculus that's sometimes shown in neuroanatomy books with the with the face, the body image is mapped to the area of the frontal cortex, and the mouth and the muscles governing the mouth is this enormous face, and the rest of the body is kind of an appendage hanging off that. So, you know, the speech center is an enormous component of the complexity of our brain, and is one of the reasons why the human brain is so complex, because, you know, language is one of the things that really sets us apart from the other creatures, even other mammals. Now, other animals do have language, but it's rudimentary compared to ours. And we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow night. The visual association area is located in the occipital lobe, the back part of the brain, and it's responsible for visual recognition. And the visual cortex, again in the occipital lobe, receives the visual input from the eyes. So again, you see, you know, these areas are associated. You've got the visual cortex receiving the raw data, and then an adjacent area of the brain actually processes that data, in a sense decrypts it, you could think of it, or filters it and makes it make sense to us. So the function of recognition and interpretation is sort of laid on top of that raw input, very much like you see with auditory input. And then another area of the brain, Wernicke's area, is another language area. It's located in the temporal lobe, and it's involved with language comprehension. So Broca's area is involved with speech production and controlling the movements of the mouth and facial muscles needed to produce language. But Wernicke's area is associated with the associative areas of the brain, and it has to do with interpreting these small mouth noises that we can't seem to stop making, that are, you know, inherently meaningless, but the brain supplies the meaning, supplies the interpretation. Okay, so we have a pretty good picture of the lobes of the brain and how these functions are divided and mapped onto the brain, and kind of how it all goes together. So, do we understand where the soul is? Have we got any better handle on what the soul is? We have a good definition of what it is, but we don't know what the soul is. And we don't really know what the relationship is between the brain and the physical substrate of the brain and what we subjectively experience as consciousness. But we have some ideas. We have some educated guesses, basically. So there are some key questions that we still don't have the answers to, and this is the frontier of neurophysiology right now, trying to answer some of these questions. Big questions, questions that have troubled people ever since they bothered to ponder these problems. You know, what is consciousness? That's a biggie. We know it exists, at least we think we know it exists, because we all experience it. When we're not asleep, we're pretty much conscious. So we're immersed in consciousness all the time. Subjectively, we know it exists. Does it originate in the brain? Does consciousness originate in the brain? Well, we think so. We can't actually say that for sure, but the assumption is that, yeah, the brain is the generator of consciousness. You know, this piece of gelatinous meat inside our skull is able to generate consciousness. It'd be nice if we knew what consciousness was, you know, but that's our assumption. Okay, so what is the self? You know, in our conscious experience, unless we're schizophrenic, for example, or have other types of mental illness, or have different types of impairments, we generally experience our own existence as an integrated self. We have a sense of self, of identity, a sense of I, and so on. But so what is that? And what constructs that? And where does that come from? And where is the self in the brain? Is there a little homunculus in the brain that's kind of like running a steam shovel, pulling these levers and pushing the buttons and making the whole thing go? Or, can you go in and cut out an area of the brain where the self resides, and after you sew the person up, then they don't have any self anymore? Well, actually, in some ways you can do that. Some of the work with neurophysiology shows that you can seriously disrupt a person's sense of self, self-integration, their body image, their notions of location in space and time, their memories and all this. But there's no one spot that we can point to and say, okay, there's the self, it's sitting right there. And I'll just aim a laser right there or whatever and ablate that, and then bye-bye self. It's not that simple. So these are, kind of eternal questions. And we're not going to answer them tonight. I don't think. But we're going to cover some interesting territory, in the process of kind of meandering around this question, if not answering this question. One of the things that's fascinated me, and I don't really think there is a solid answer, is consciousness something that the brain generates? That's the usual assumption. But the alternative assumption is that consciousness is something that permeates the continuum. And the brain is a detector of consciousness, much in the way a radio is a detector of radio waves. And, we're all surrounded by radio waves here all the time, but we're not aware of it until we turn on the radio and start tuning it, and then all the stations start to come in. And I think our experience of psychedelics does open this possibility, because we often have that sense. And where does all this stuff come from? Does our brain generate it, or does it come in from the outside? All these ayahuasca beings and the others and all that. And of course a reductionist psychiatrist or neuroanatomist would just say, you've screwed up the wiring of your brain and you're having hallucinations or delusions. But that's not our subjective sense of it. It's much more integrated and coherent than that. It does not, the psychedelic experience does not seem to be, the random noise generated by a diseased or disordered brain. So I think the signal is still, the question is still out. The brain may as much be a detector of consciousness, a detector of the signal, as it is a generator of consciousness. We really don't know. Now, we can talk about different, what you might call neurotechnologies. In the last few decades, in the last couple of decades really, there have been incredible advances in the tools that have come available to us to examine these questions. Whether consciousness is generated by the brain, whether it's detected. We can actually now, using these new neural technologies, we can sort of peek in on the brain while it's doing stuff. We can look at the brain in different states, and we can look at what parts of the brain are activated and so on. So more than ever, we have a window on the sort of neuromechanics of consciousness and subjective experiences. A lot of these neurotechnologies fall under the category that we call neuroimaging. And there are several that are quite important, that are quite useful. One is electroencephalography, which is a way of measuring the discharges of electrical activity across the surface of different lobes of the brain. And you've probably seen pictures of, if you saw National Geographic a while back, of the Tibetan monk hooked up to a net of electrodes. It used to be we could only look at a few channels at a time, but now we can, with processing capabilities being what they are, we can look at hundreds of frequencies at a time and get a fairly more comprehensive picture. Another one is computerized axial tomography, or CAT scans. This is basically an X-ray method for making three-dimensional images of brain regions. Another one that's quite exciting is MRI, or so-called fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's functional because it gives you it's dynamic. You can use it to map what's going on in brain structures in real time. Another one is PET, positron emission tomography. Another one is SPECT, single photon emission computerized tomography. I'll talk in more detail about each of these in a minute. So we have these neurotechnologies, these brain imaging techniques, and thanks to computers, basically, and technological ingenuity, we have these techniques. But what we also have that are important tools are what we might call altered state technologies. In other words, these are what we can apply. These are the probes that we can apply to the brain to see what happens when we're looking at what's going on in the brain during altered states, or even during so-called customary states. So altered state technologies include obviously things like psychedelics, shamanism, meditation, and prayer. And we can use these tools in conjunction with neuroimaging technologies to get an idea of what is going on in these different states. So this is electroencephalography. And this is just shows, it's basically a way to map electrical activity in populations of neurons. As the brain functions, as it thinks, or whatever it is that it does, there are waves of electricity that move across the cortex, and they can often be correlated with conscious experience. So this is a way to look at these waves and what areas of the brain become activated on ayahuasca, say, what are the frequencies that are activated, how does that differ from, say, sleep or dreams, and that sort of thing. So EEG gives us the tools to measure the electrical activity in the brain. CAT, or CT, computerized tomography, is not used so much anymore for neuroanatomy because the resolution is very low, but it's basically an X-ray technique. That's another reason it's not used, because X-ray, X-radiation is harmful. But it's a way to, in the living brain, take a slice, a thin slice of a section of the brain and image that to a screen. And by superimposing these images, you can build up a three-dimensional picture. But it's not, the resolution is rather poor. Interestingly, one of the other applications of CT technology is airline security. When you put your baggage through one of those scanners at the airport, that's what they're doing. They're giving it a CT scan, which is maybe why that's not very effective either. Poor resolution. They can't see the pocket knife that you're smuggling through. Or perhaps the cigarette lighter in my case. Anyway, fMRI is much more, gives much better resolution now, and it doesn't involve radiation as such, so it's preferred now to CT technology. MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. And what it is it's based on the absorption and emission of radio waves by protons in water inside the cells. So when you're put into the tunnel, you're exposed to a very powerful electromagnetic field, and this excites the protons, and they give off a resonance that you can detect by another magnetic detector. It doesn't hurt the tissue. Apparently it has no effect as far as we know. And the fMRI reiteration of this or advance of this, basically MRI gives you a picture of static structures. Still very useful, but fMRI will actually give you a dynamic picture of what's going on. So very useful technique. This particular movie shows the activation of specific brain areas in a depressed patient after several weeks of treatment with antidepressant medications. So that's what the little red dots are there. Don't ask me what the interpretation of this is. I just ripped this off the internet. So nice picture though, yeah? Okay, and positron emission tomography is another dynamic neuroimaging technique. Dynamic being that it gives you, a movie. It gives you a real-time picture of what's going on. And the way that it works is you put into the brain a positron-emitting molecule, usually a glucose molecule. You administer it intravenously, it goes into the brain, and as it decays, you get that antimatter-matter interaction. This is at very low levels, but the glucose, since glucose is the fuel of the brain, that is what it eats, that's what it needs to function. So there's a correlation between the areas of the brain where the glucose is being metabolized most rapidly with brain activity. So if you can say, okay, you use the ligand that is used or the drug that is used is fluorodeoxyglucose. So it's a glucose analog. And if it goes mostly to, say, the frontal cortex when you're thinking, you can map this using PET, and you can say, well, most of the activity is going on in this area and that area of the brain. So that is also very useful. SPECT is another similar technique. I couldn't find any animation for this one, but it's another way to measure blood flow. It's another way to measure, it's another dynamic imaging technology for measuring blood flow. Instead of using glucose, you can actually inject a labeled, a radioisotope labeled drug, pharmaceutical, into the brain. So if you want to, say, image the serotonin transporter, for example, you can label a drug like Prozac, for example, a selective serotonin uptake inhibitor, with the appropriate isotope and inject that and see how the brain metabolizes that. So and then the radiation that is emitted for SPECT is gamma rays. So then the SPECT detector is essentially a gamma ray detector. These techniques are marvelous. They give us the tools to watch what the brain is doing when the brain is doing whatever it is that it does. But then it becomes even more useful when we combine it with altered state technologies, or what you also might call technologies of the sacred. The neuroimaging technologies give us the windows, but the altered state technologies, these very ancient techniques, give us a way to put the brain into specific states, and then we can sort of spy on it and see what is going on at the neuroanatomical level, at the physiological level, when we're having a psychedelic experience, for example, or a meditative experience, or a mystical experience, or sleeping, or waking, or, you know, when we're looking through a catalog and lusting after, you know, that new Mac that I like, or perhaps the BMW that somebody'd like to buy. In fact, these techniques are all being used for marketing and things like that. This is sort of the dark side of neuroimaging, because marketers can actually take focus groups and put them in an fMRI and then show them, you know, Pepsi versus Coca-Cola, for example, and see, you know, what lights up. And this is being done. This is definitely being done. Neural marketing is a whole new area to, you know, get us to. They can figure out what, you know, they can get right into the brain. And so anyway, meditation is obviously one of these altered state technologies. And meditation, yoga are one way to develop altered states without the benefit of drugs. So they're a way to call on our own neurochemistry to induce altered states. So as a way of sort of defining a baseline, meditation is very useful because there's nothing introduced into the system. It's just the brain's doing what it does in a state of calm relaxation. And so you can see, you know, what areas of the brain are activated or not, or suppressed during a state of meditation. Now, you can also extend this to, well, in the case of psychedelics, psychedelics are, in some ways, you can think of them as molecular probes for studying consciousness, for studying the relationship between the brain and the mind, the so-called brain-mind interface. And as you know, if you know basic pharmacology, the way drugs work usually is they bind to various receptors in the brain, various neurotransmitter receptors. In the case of psychedelics, they interact with serotonin receptors. And this picture on the right there is a diagram of the LSD molecule nesting into the receptor site of the of the serotonin receptor, in this case the 5-HT2A receptors. So this is very useful because we can define relationships between the molecular configuration or structure of a psychedelic molecule and the kinds of subjective states or conscious states that it produces. Now, prayer is another useful altered state technology that can be studied using these techniques. Prayer, meditation usually focuses on an inner state. It's really about the communion with the self. And it differs from prayer in that prayer usually involves communication or communion with something outside the self, or something that is understood and thought and perceived to be outside the self, whether it be, you know, whatever you wish to call that thing. But it has somewhat difference, it is a somewhat different state of mind. But in both prayer and meditation, ego consciousness is suppressed, so they have that in common, and you can watch what's happening. Now, this gentleman here is a neuroscientist at UCSD, runs the Center for Brain and Cognition laboratory, and he's written several popular books. The one that I'm most familiar with is a book called Phantoms in the Brain. And he has written some very interesting popular books that try and relate the data that's coming out of the neuroscience lab and out of these brain imaging studies with our own subjective experience of self and mind. And he talks about qualia. Qualia, subjective experiences involve a sense of quality. We have, our subjective experience is that we're pretty much located in space and time. We have a sense of separation between ourselves and the external environment. We have an integrated notion of who we are and where we are, and as we move down the stream of time. And so this is one of the questions that he's trying to answer. We agree pretty much provisionally that consciousness is located in the brain, but how does this neural machinery result in experience, what we experience as consciousness? Where is it located? And what's the relationship between qualia, our qualitative experience of being, subjective being, and the neurophysiological processes that are going on in the background that we're not really aware of except through subjective experience, unless we happen to be in an MRI machine, then we can see other aspects of that. So how does the brain put it all together? How does it actually create this experience of qualia? And we generally experience ourself as one thing. We don't think of ourselves in most of the time as many selves. But one theory that he's come up with that I think is very appealing, because it does have explanatory power, is that there are actually many selves, and each self is mediated by a different part of the brain. And our experience of being and subjective awareness is a composite of this that is woven together and integrated by yet other parts of the brain. So each part of the brain processes different aspects of our experience of subjective awareness, subjective being, and then somehow in the end, it's integrated together so that the brain creates a simulation of subjective experience of our being in the world. This is what some people have suggested. Well, this is the hallucination that we have created, that we've all agreed to call consensus reality, and we proceed to live there. And it doesn't really resemble reality, but we'll get to that. So one of the things that comes out of Ramachandran's work that I'm impressed by is how little of the brain is needed to synthesize reality. Most of what the brain is doing, it's all going on in the background. You're never even aware of it. You can think of it as housekeeping functions in a sense. But the part that maintains the illusion of selfhood is mediated by only a few parts of the neuroanatomy. So he talks about the 7 cells. He postulates 7 cells. And there is the embodied self, the part that maintains our image, our body image, and that is localized in the parietal lobes and projects to the frontal lobes. There's the passionate self, the part that mediates emotions and personality, and that's pretty much localized in the temporal lobes or the amygdala. There's the executive self, the part that does things, that acts on input, makes decisions and takes actions. And that part is pretty much mediated by the anterior cingulate gyrus and projections to the motor cortex. There's the mnemonic self, the self of memory, the self that creates the personal story that we tell ourselves that places us in space and time. And that is localized to the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the temporal lobes. There is the unified self, the one that fills in the gaps in the picture, the one that, if necessary, through confabulation, through basically making stuff up, is involved in weaving all this kind of other input together into a coherent experience of self and being, primarily located in the amygdala and the anterior cingulate gyrus. There's the vigilant self, the one that is involved with perception and tracking, the one that monitors the environment and responds to it. And that is located also in the anterior cingulate gyrus, the thalamic nuclei, and the brainstem. And finally, there is the conceptual and social self, the I function, the ego function, the one that we present to the world, to other people in our social interactions. And that is mediated and controlled by the cerebral hemispheres. And there's no real hierarchy implied here. All of these cells have to work together to synthesize the hallucination that is reality. So the reality hallucination. Reality is a crutch for people who can't cope with drugs. It's really true if you think about it. If you think about how our brain apprehends reality, we integrate the input from all of these different cells, and essentially we construct a model of reality. And then we live in that model. And the model is a provisional model. It's imperfect. The reality itself is unknowable. We never perceive